Hello, I'm Allison Raymiller, Director of Research Programs at Solve ME CFS Initiative. We're really excited that so many of you have joined us today for discussion with Dr. Sadie Whitaker, our Chief Scientific Officer on the U+Me Registry. Sadie received her PhD in molecular biology at University of Birmingham in the UK and a degree in biochemistry from the University of Leeds, also in the UK. Since traveling across the pond to the US, Sadie has accumulated extensive experience in the biotech industry, in clinical development for biologic medicines, and in strategic leadership roles for advocacy, policy, communication, and external engagement. Sadie brings a deep understanding of scientific discovery, drug development, drug commercialization processes, and I can speak to this personally working with her, really creative and collaborative way of thinking. She's been with us at Solve since the end of the summer, and it's been great to have her here and to dig in on the development of the U+Me registry. So with that, again, I'm pleased to introduce Sadie, and she'll take it away.
Hello everybody, good morning, good afternoon. We are going to try and make this webinar as interactive as possible, and we have a couple of polling questions that we're going to do throughout the course of the presentation, as well as present the results back from the polling questions that we sent out ahead of this webinar. So we're going to start with the first poll question. So if you can answer this question, are you an individual with ME/CFS, a caregiver or a loved one of a patient with ME/CFS, a researcher, a clinician, or other? So if you could complete that information, and then we'll flash up the results so we have a sense of who's on this call.
The poll is operating now. If everyone could please log your responses. I see that 85% of people have responded. We'll just give it a few more seconds. All right, we'll be closing the poll now. Thank you everyone for responding. Okay,
so hopefully everyone can see this. A majority of people on the call are individuals affected with ME/CFS. We also have 16% of you who are a caregiver, and 9% researchers, 3% clinicians, and 2% other. So thanks for that, and thanks for joining us today. I don't think I need to go through too much on this slide. Everybody knows about this disease, and I think most of you are aware of us, SMCI, as an organization. What I would like to highlight is this grey bar at the bottom of the slide. Since joining the organization at the end of May, I've really adopted these 4 central pillars to how we approach everything we do in science and discovery. So where possible, we're going to enhance research infrastructure. So that's through things like the registry. It's also through programs like our Ramsey Grant program, where we're bringing new researchers into the field and keeping them engaged in this area of research. Collaboration is something that I feel very passionate about, especially in a small community like this. We really need to work more closely together to try and advance discovery. Putting patients at the center of everything we do in a meaningful way is absolutely central to everything we do. And then last, I really want to do a better job of communicating what we know in research as a way to drive awareness of this disease. So drive awareness among clinicians, also among the general public, but in an interesting way where we're picking key findings that are kind of give a hook that will enable people to then learn more about this disease. And so you'll see these 4 threads pulled through into the registry, which is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. So welcome to the You and Me movement. We are very excited about where the progress we're making with our registry. We're thinking of it as a movement because we want to get on the big data, the wave of big data. Coming from an oncology background, I'm a big believer in having large amounts of data to really be able to understand subtypes of disease and to be able to identify druggable targets. There was a time in cancer when there was one breast cancer. Everybody, I think, accepts that there is now probably 50 different types of breast cancer, and that's really been the result of big data sets that have enabled us to identify various subtypes and identify within those subtypes which drug therapies are most likely to be effective, leading to breast cancer really now being a chronic disease. So all of that to say, I think big data is really going to be a solution for ME/CFS, and we hope the registry is going to be the start of a movement towards that direction. When we started to think about the registry, we wanted to really come at this with a blank piece of paper and say, what is it that we want to create? We have an opportunity here to create a valuable resource that can serve the whole community. How do we do that in the most effective way? So let me talk around this circle a little bit. If we start on the left with the iPhone icon, we wanted an opportunity for people to be able to enter data on a continuous basis. So previously or historically, registries generally capture data at single time points, either annually or monthly, and we really wanted to have more of a moving picture of an idea of what this disease symptoms of what patients were going through with this disease. So we decided that we wanted to incorporate a mobile tracking app that would enable patients to self-report their symptoms on a continuous basis. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we worked with patients to design the best approach for doing that. If we move anti-clockwise around the circle, obviously biospecimens is a key part of any registry and biobank, and we want to integrate approaches that will facilitate specimen collection among the patient population. So, for example, at-home blood draws, as well as working with LIFT to allow house and bedbound patients to provide samples in an easy way. So that's something that we're actively pursuing with the people at LIFT. And then last, could we incorporate mobile van collection at scientific conferences? So we could collect blood samples from patients, but also from a number of healthy volunteers who may be present at scientific conferences. The next icon, which you see, is looks like the Apple iWatch. We want to incorporate wearables. Obviously, passive data collection is much easier, and there's not the same issues with compliance that you get from having to enter the data yourself. So we want to incorporate wearables. We also would like to incorporate Alexa, so that for those patients who are not able to type on a computer, they're able to enter their data through voice-activated technology. And last, we would eventually like to incorporate electronic health records. This is a fairly large lift in the US, as many of you know, but being able to tie those pieces of data together, both the patient-reported data as well as the clinician data from the electronic health record, will give us a complete picture. We want to make sure that people are connected to the research. So if you see the icon at the bottom of this circle with the 3 people, we don't just want to collect data and then that's the last you hear about it. We want to make sure that if someone uses your data, you know that someone's using it in research. We want to report back that your data has enabled somebody to make a discovery, and really connect the process, so that it's not just like giving data into the ether and then you never hear back from it again. Moving up, you see the graph icon. We want the data to be presented back to patients in a way which is compelling, so that the app and the data you enter can be used to track your own symptoms, and also to enable you to share those symptoms back with your healthcare provider. Moving further up to this icon, which is for researchers around jigsaw puzzle, I think it looks like. We want to, I mentioned in the earlier slide that we want this to be more collaborative. So anybody who applies to use data from the registry or biobank will commit to sharing both their methodology as well as their data into a shared pool on a secure database, but everybody will be sharing kind of what they've learned, but also how they've got to the results that they have and the methods that they've used. We want people to share both negative and positive findings. So, you know, historically, it's difficult sometimes to find out what has not worked because only usually positive data are published. So we'd like to change that a little bit and share both positive and negative data. And then last, this last icon of the two hands at the top, while we want obviously the data to be available for researchers who are vetted through a peer review process to use the data, we also want to have this data available to non-traditional actors. So we want patients to be able to analyse the data in aggregate, not just their own data at the patient level, but at the population level, and allow people who maybe, you know, are not the traditional researchers to be able to come in and look at this data and perhaps come up with some things that others may not have thought of. So those were kind of where we started. Those are the components we wanted to bring in. And then if you just look at the grey bar at the bottom, these were, again, the principles we wanted to bring through. So we wanted everything to be human-centered. We wanted to design this with patients, with caregivers, also with researchers, with clinicians. We want this to be usable and useful. We obviously don't know everything there is to know about building a registry and a biobank, so we've been collaborating heavily with cross-disciplinary experts. So Len Jason, for example, who knows a lot about survey design, people who know a lot about informatics, people who know how to develop apps, etc. So we've really been integrating everything we do into this pool of cross-disciplinary experts. And then I've talked a little bit about open science, how the data source will be open and available. Importantly, everybody who enters data into the U+Me registry will own their own data and will decide how and if it is used. And then last, we are intending to make U+Me a global registry. So I talked about the power of big data. I think we need to apply that to where we accept patients from, and also consolidating our database with other registries which may be ongoing around the world, so that all of the data can be consolidated into a single place and allow us the biggest possible pool of information to research from. I mentioned a little bit about how we're collaborating with cross-disciplinary experts, and this is the approach we've been taking. So we want this to be a community resource, and we've been applying a community approach to its design. So if we look at the pillar on the left, I talked a little bit about human-centered design. This is the patient-focused aspect of that. We have been speaking to individuals with the disease across the severity spectrum, as well as circulating an online survey, which many of you completed as part of registering for this webinar. And we're going to review those results in a couple of slides. But what we asked was, what would be the core symptoms that you would want to prioritize for ongoing capture? So capture via the app on an ongoing basis. What do you believe the optimal frequency would be? What method would you like to use? And how would you like to see the data reported back to them? So we'll see the results of that coming up. The middle pillar here is speaking to the experts. So data collection, the data elements we should use. I talked a little bit about the informatics. Obviously, when you're talking about personal health information, there are a lot of legal and privacy concerns, and so we've been working with a legal team to make sure that everything we do is buttoned up and compliant with privacy laws. We've been talking about the survey instruments and data elements, how we can standardize the data and biosample collection, how we are going to be able to integrate the app from an informatics standpoint, as well as IRBs, informed consents, and I mentioned the data privacy already. And then on the right, we've begun to talk to clinicians and researchers, starting with SMCI's Research Advisory Council. We're talking about, does this data plan seem good to you? Is this the kind of information that would be useful to you as you're doing research? And then talking to clinicians about the kind of symptoms that patients complain of most, and whether the U+Me registry is going to capture those, as well as approaches for recruiting patients. So we've begun that, and we will continue that in the coming weeks. So we should have had a drum roll here. This is the big reveal. Many of you completed a survey for us, and thank you so much for doing that ahead of this webinar. So I mentioned we had already spoken to or surveyed a number of patients across the severity spectrum, and then we've bolstered those numbers with the survey that you all completed ahead of the webinar. So we had 167 respondents. And let's talk a little bit about the information in the orange box. So the 5 symptoms that you see kind of in a darker orange: fatigue, post-exertional malaise, orthostatic intolerance, cognitive impairment, and unrefreshing sleep. Those were the 5 symptoms that came up as a result of our initial surveying and phone conversations. When you all completed the survey recently, joint pain and muscle pain were added to that group of 5. So these were the symptoms that were most frequent, you thought were important to capture on an ongoing basis, and that were capturing information on these symptoms would be most meaningful to you. Less often reported in the survey, but if it was reported, it was highly prioritized among those who did report it, were tender or sore lymph nodes, muscle tremors, and headaches. So in terms of how the app is going to capture these symptoms, we're going to go on to that in a couple of slides, but I think what's reassuring to us is that we do have the key symptoms captured that are meaningful and that you all believe would make the biggest difference in being able to track and monitor your disease. If you look at the bar graphs on the right-hand side, so we asked you about frequency of data collection, and majority said weekly, closely followed by daily. We're currently thinking that every 3-day schedule would be appropriate, and the reason we're thinking that is because we're not confident that if we did weekly collection that we would capture post-exertional malaise in a kind of a timely way that would enable the data to be meaningful. So our current model is that we would capture data every 3 days, but with the option for patients to reduce that frequency to weekly if they so choose. And then this bottom bar chart, what would be the most meaningful way to view your data? I think people wanted to look at trends, right? So 26% wanted to look at real-time data, which is, I enter information in the morning and I can see it immediately and see what I entered, versus being able to look at trends over a week or trends over a month. And I'm going to show you in a few slides what the data visualization of some of those trends would look like. So thank you. This is incredibly helpful to us, and this feedback will be incorporated into how we structure the design of the registry. So last, before I move off this slide, you see the green hands. A number of you took the time to enter, type in, more detailed perspectives on the survey, and so we're going to highlight some of those in these green boxes as we're going through the presentation, and talk about how the You and Me registry is addressing some of those perspectives. So this is the current design. So there's a lot of information on here, so let's just talk through it piece by piece. If you start on the left-hand side with the 0 months baseline collection, if you sign up to be part of the registry, what will happen is you'll get a link to the peer platform, which is an online platform where you'll enter demographics, medical history. There'll be a checkbox where you can check if you're physician confirmed. You'll enter diagnostic criteria. You will complete the short form, as well as a list of medications and the DSQ. Once you've completed that information, you will then get a link to download an app, and you'll register into the app. And I'm now scooting up to the top of this slide, the green arrows. You will enter data via the app every 3 days, or like I said, if you prefer to do it less frequently, you'll be able to choose to do it weekly on some core symptoms. The app will also enable you to track whatever other symptoms you'd like to track for yourself, but the core symptoms are what will form the backbone of the registry. So that ongoing data capture will happen, and then after 12 months, you'll be prompted from the peer platform to go back in and update the DSQ and answer some questions about whether your medications have changed, and then obviously continue to do the ongoing tracking via the app. So we hope by having these large data collections kind of annually, or at baseline and then updated annually, combined with these just capturing data on the core symptoms, that will create a very rich data set that will allow researchers to better understand the disease. So this is the workflow. So I talked a little bit about this. You'll register with the peer platform. A screenshot is shown on the bottom of the left-hand side of this slide. You will review and sign an informed consent. You are able to set your privacy directives, so you will be able to determine how your data is being used or what degree of privacy you want to set over your information. And like I said, you'll complete the baseline surveys. Then you'll download the app, create the login. You'll also enter a unique ID, and that ID will come to you via email after you've completed the peer baseline surveys. That unique ID is how we're tying together these two pieces of data. The peer platform and the app data will be connected by a de-identified unique ID. You'll enter symptom data via the app. And importantly, we will program it so that you'll get push notifications at a certain time that will prompt you to answer some core symptom questions. And then I already mentioned you can opt also to do some personalized tracking. So the goal here is that you will obtain insights into your disease that can be shared with your permission. You'll contribute to research, but you'll also be able to see how your data compares with others. I want to talk for a minute now about the peer platform. Peer stands for Platform for Engaging Everyone Responsibly, and this is a network that enables multiple diseases to create registries kind of within a shared platform. The nice thing about that is that you exist in a collaborative network. And what that means is, for example, if you wanted to work with an organization that was studying mitochondrial dysfunction, you could, with the patient's permission, access the registry data from an organization that is studying mitochondrial dysfunction and add to our existing database. So it's a way of being able to not just look at trends within an individual disease, but to pick up areas that may have a commonality across diseases and see if there's any areas that should be picked up for further study. So we really like that. It has a completely patient-centered functionality, and you as the patient own this data and you get to decide how it's used. One of the concerns that came back from the survey was someone was worried about having so much health information about themselves online. Well, we're pleased to say that with the peer platform, that you can absolutely control the degree of privacy around your data. And if you see the 3 individuals along the bottom here who have graciously agreed to be our community guides, Jenny Spotilla, Brian Vestag, and Wilhelmina Jenkins, you are able to go onto the peer platform and see the levels of privacy that they have set. They're really on the peer platform to create a model for you to understand where you want your privacy levels to be and how you want your data to be used. I'm going to talk for a few minutes now about the app. So I mentioned that we wanted to do ongoing data capture, and that when we did initial conversations and surveys, an app came back as the most preferred route to capture this information. So we've been working closely with Chris Armstrong, who has created an app for chronic disease that is very simple and easy to use, and we think is going to be a really great fit for the U+Me registry. So when we started to think about what we wanted from an app, if you look at the first box on the left-hand side that's marked phase 1, these were really the requirements that we sat down and wrote out. So we wanted the symptom reporting to be easy, so either a checkbox or a sliding scale. We wanted the ability to have open text if people wanted to add more information. We wanted to be able to log events that may be preceding a post-exertional malaise. Next, we wanted to be the people who use the app to not only be able to track the core symptoms that were important for the registry, but to track any symptoms, right? If you as a patient are going to take the time to add information about your health, we didn't want people to be limited in what we were asking for. So we wanted it to be expansive and flexible. Push notifications was a big deal. Compliance when you're entering data on anything, right, is an issue, and so push notifications we thought would be helpful for that. We wanted people to be able to see their data presented back to them graphically. And then we also wanted the ability that if you were using the app and you wanted to participate in other research, you could have that option, and that would be a really easy thing for you to do. And then last, we wanted there to be a news feed where we would provide research updates, both from you and me, but also just in general about existing research, as well as link people to online communities, so there was that social component. Then we've talked a little bit about wearables. We want wearables to be able to be integrated. And we'd also like people to be able to see community level data. And what I mean by that is you could see how your data stacks up against everybody else who's using the app as part of the U+Me registry. So those two are pieces that we're working on for phase 2. But importantly, the base code is going to be created in such a way that those two things can be easily added. So hopefully, this represents what's also important to you. We were pleased to see from some of the survey data that's shown in the green box on the right that you also agreed with some of this. So an ongoing quarterly report of other sufferers, reports on research trends, posting of clinical trials, all of those will be incorporated into the newsfeed. And I think once you see the app and you see how user-friendly it is, I think you'll be really excited and pleased at where we've landed. And Chris has really done a great job at developing something that is simple and easy to use, but is an effective way to capture and share data back with the people who are using it. So I think we have another polling question. Oh, not quite. Yep, we do. Sorry. I'm getting mixed information here from Alison. We do have another polling question coming up here. So I talked about integration of wearables and how I think that's going to be very important for passive data collection. We're going to launch a poll now that talks about what kind of wearables you might currently use, whether you use them at all. So if we can launch the poll and have people answer the question. So are you currently using any of the following to track your daily activity? A heart rate monitor, a pedometer or step counter, a fitness tracker, or not applicable, which means you're not currently using any tech to monitor your activity.
Thank you, Sadie. The poll is now active. We have 65% of our audience responding. We'll just wait a few more moments for everyone else to jump on, and then we'll go ahead and close the poll. Polling is now closed.
Thank you, Emily. So I'm kind of surprised by this, actually. I thought that there would be more use of step counters and Fitbits So I think this is really interesting. I think if we were to incorporate wearables into the U+Me registry, we would certainly provide those wearables so that we could have consistent data being slurped from the tracker into the registry data. So this is interesting that many of you don't currently use any technology to monitor your activity, and maybe we can do some follow-up after this webinar to really dig into that and find out why. Is it just that they're not available, or that you haven't thought of it, or that there is a real preference not to track daily activity in this way? So definitely something that we'd like to dig into a little bit more there. On this graph here, it shows 5 lines: fatigue, orthostatic intolerance, post-exertional malaise, cognitive impairment, unrefreshing sleep. You can see how those symptoms are stacked up over a period of time. And this graph shows how the patient was feeling about these 5 common symptoms with time points occurring every 3 days. So I think this is really compelling in the sense that you can not only track your own data, but you would also be able to share this with a physician between visits so that they would have a better sense of the disease burden. This is a similar graph. This looks at step counts in the grey bars, as well as overall wellness. And so you can see how the activity levels and the wellness kind of are stacking up against each other. So these 2 slides were just to give you an indication of how the data visualizations will happen as part of the app. So if you'll enter your data every 3 days, and you'll be able to see aggregated feeds like this that will give you some indications as to your overall wellness, things that may be triggering increased fatigue or post-exertional malaise. And then, like I said, will enable you to share information with your clinician. The other thing, which I think is going to be very compelling way to use the data, is that here at SMCI, we're going to be able to look at the data at the population level and really be able to use some data visualizations to communicate about the burden of this disease. And I think I often find data visualization a much more compelling way to share information. And so we hope to mine the data to really be able to use it to talk about disease burden and to raise awareness. This talks about informatics, which is my least favorite subject, mostly because I don't know enough about it. But luckily, we have experts on hand who are helping us with the informatics aspects of the registry. So let's start on the left. So you'll enter data via the peer platform on the orange computer, and then you'll enter data on an ongoing basis via the green app. The data at that point, as it leaves the electronic device, becomes de-identified. And these sort of stacks of checkers are supposed to indicate the cloud and the data on the cloud. So we have these 2 data streams coming from 2 different sources. Those 2 will then be aggregated using that unique identifier that I talked about earlier. And then researchers can apply either to become a vetted researcher. So for example, if you're at a university and you want to have continuous access to the data, you can apply to become a vetted researcher. Or if you just want to do an individual study, you can apply to do an individual study. Those applications will come to a research planning committee that I'm going to review on the next slide. If you're approved, you can then access the aggregated data sets. So the reason we have this kind of bifurcated process is that we really wanted the access to the data to be really easy, to be nimble, not cumbersome. And so if you're a vetted researcher, you'll be able to just access the data and refresh it every day if you wanted to. So you're almost getting a continuous data stream. So we thought that would be a really cool way for people to be able to better understand the disease and to be able to access the data in a really nimble way. This talks about the research planning committee. So obviously we don't just want to give the data or the biospecimens out to anybody. And so we are constructing a research planning committee that is made up of individuals with the disease, clinicians, researchers, caregivers, and data experts. We also have the ability to recruit subject matter experts on an ad hoc basis. Essentially, they will receive proposals for access to the data. And then the panel, which will always include an individual with a disease, a researcher, a clinician, a researcher with expertise in a different area of science, but expertise in the methodology that the researcher intends to use, will review the proposal and make a decision about whether or not to provide access or to the data or the biospecimen or both. Additionally, we would like this group to come up with some potential uses for the data in a more proactive way. So I talked about how I think this is going to be really useful to look at the burden of disease and create compelling data visualizations that really look at disease burden on society. We hope that this group will, as we aggregate more and more data, we'll be able to come up with some really good ideas for us about how we can best leverage this information that we have in the registry. I talked in an earlier slide about how we want this to be a global registry. This slide highlights the different biobanks and registries that exist around the world. And you see that picture in the top left is me meeting with Luis Nasul and his team at the London School. They're our first recruit, and they are open to combining and globalizing our registry so that we can get them up the UK Biobank on board, and then the hope is that piece by piece we can get more and more of these individual registries and biobanks to be part of a single big data source. So we're working with Luis now to see how we can aggregate those data fields and what that aggregated registry and biobank would look like. So last, I talked a little bit about how I thought it was important that we leverage everything we do in science and discovery to raise awareness. This is a specific idea that we're pursuing about how we can use the registry to raise awareness of the disease among clinicians. So the idea here is that we would partner with a closed healthcare system like a Kaiser, and we've actually had some initial conversations with both Kaiser and the VA. But the idea would be that we would pitch to them that we would run a pilot where we would ask their teams to identify patients for the registry and biobank. We expect that when we go into these systems, there will be less than 100% awareness of the disease, and so that there will be some education that will be needed for their physician populations in order for them to be able to identify patients. So we would instigate an educational program, run a webinar, for example, hold some lunch and learns. These would be in-person events with prominent ME/CFS clinicians, and then develop some materials that people could carry in their lab coat. So a pocket-sized version of the diagnostic criteria or some other educational information. We would develop communication PR campaign around it, both to raise awareness, but also to make the pilot more appealing to the healthcare system. And then obviously we would want to build in metrics so that we could measure success, but then use that information to scale this idea to multiple hospitals or to multiple health systems. So we're pleased that this addresses this need, it's highlighted in green, that came up from the survey, which is, I hope it will help gather data for research and treatment and cure. We believe it will, but I hope it will help in educating our healthcare providers about the varied list of signs and symptoms of ME. So this is a very direct way that we can do that. Okay, so hopefully you are as excited about the registry as we are. We are asking you to contribute what you can, right? That means your data. We have a link here where you can pre-register for the You and Me registry. If you pre-register, as soon as the registry goes live, we will be able to send you a link to sign up. and begin to enter your information. Your ideas, you've all contributed to the online survey, and that's been incredibly useful for us. But if you haven't been able to complete that survey yet, please feel free to click the link and enter some information. Or if you'd like to email us any thoughts you have, or we'd also be willing to talk to you by phone if that's something you're interested in. And then obviously your financial support is what makes everything we do possible. And the registry is certainly an area that we believe we'd like to make as big and as dynamic as possible, and obviously financial support is needed for that. So thanks to everyone for listening, and I think now we're going to open it up to questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sadie, for taking us through all of that. And while she was presenting, we did have some questions roll in, so I want to thank you all for being an engaged audience. So first of all, we had, I'll actually consolidate this because there were a couple of questions that kind of pertained to whether or not someone needs to have a physician-confirmed diagnosis to participate. Particularly, someone mentioned their experience going to multiple different types of physicians and specialists, resulting in different diagnoses and lacking some amount of consensus amongst them. So can that type of person still qualify for the registry? It's been an exhausting process, of course, to move through that piece. So Sadie, what within the registry itself, do individuals have to have a physician-confirmed diagnosis of ME using any of the different case definition criteria? What does the setup look like for that?
So the registry is going to be open to anybody, either who is diagnosed or if they think they have the disease, along with healthy controls. But there will be a checkbox that will ask if you have been physician diagnosed or not. So on the back end, researchers will be able to pick apart that data and understand which of the samples are physician confirmed or not. If you have checked the box that you are not, or if you do not check the box that you're physician confirmed, I think that's also going to flag to us that we may want to link you to some potential resources so that you could go see a physician and become confirmed. Another thing that we're looking to integrate is an algorithm that Len Jason is working on, where based on the baseline survey data that you enter, the algorithm will enable us to determine whether or not you meet diagnostic criteria.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I know that Sadie and I have had some intro conversations with Len Jason with our interest to develop an algorithm, because he and his research group have done all of this work on the DePaul symptom questionnaire, which collects a wide range of symptom and severity, frequency and severity of those symptoms via that survey, which is part of our baseline collection. The group, as part of that, have developed cutoff scores based on how people respond with their symptoms and the severity and frequency of those symptoms that line up with the various different case definitions. So I think our hope is that with the physician confirmation box, which we help kind of oversee that piece, that we could also develop an algorithm that would report back to an individual based on their DSQ responses, which case definition they qualify for. So both being informative for the participants that can't see a doctor, can't have access to a doctor that is knowledgeable about ME, and also corroborating a diagnosis from physicians that can have some amount of variability in how they assess patients. Great. And so then another question is, Sadie, you mentioned that you are really passionate about making sure that non-traditional actors have access to this data, bringing in kind of different perspectives. So one individual asked, and this is kind of an interesting question just based on your background from therapeutics and drug development, but what might be done to increase access to investigate alternative therapies and treatment interventions, allowing alternative practitioners or other types of functional medicine to, use the data and see if there might be any benefit explored there?
I mean, I think, as I mentioned, the data is going to be available to anybody who becomes a vetted researcher. So we would encourage people who may want to consider alternative therapies or alternative practitioners to really look at this information and see if, by taking a holistic approach to addressing the symptoms, not just the individual symptoms, but how the symptoms in aggregate stack up, we'd be more than open to people looking at the data in that way. And we think by collecting the data in this way on an ongoing basis of these core symptoms, it will facilitate that kind of analysis.
No, that's great. As we know, a lot of patients have found benefit from different types of therapies. And I know one of the things that you're also interested in is maybe exploring the idea of a bake-off, right? Where we look at different treatments that patients have used and try and compare them. And maybe, you know, getting a data set like this going might be a way in which we can better identify treatments to put into that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll also be interesting from just a case study perspective to be able to look at, oh, these patients tried this therapy, these patients tried this therapy, this is how that stacks up with their symptoms, and to look for trends and identify patterns. I mentioned earlier in the presentation about the oncology example. You really don't know what's in the data until you get enough of it and you can start to see the patterns. In hindsight, these trends are really obvious, but you can't see them until you have enough data. And so that's really our goal, to get as big a data set as possible through people proactively signing up for U+Me, but also by us aggregating data from other registries around the world.
Great. Just a quick reminder, it looks like some folks are using the raise the hand function. We're actually just asking everyone to submit any questions via the chat box that we mentioned at the start of the webinar. I think we have time for just a couple more questions, but any questions you do submit, I promise you we will see them and have some form of follow-up.
And I did see there was a question about activity trackers, and the fact that many patients are debilitated and don't exercise or are bedridden. Of course, but that's exactly what you would, you know, the information that would be compelling from an activity tracker, right? Like, I think if you compared the activity levels of a healthy control with a patient using an activity tracker, that contrast is going to be so stark and so compelling that I think it's going to be really informative, both about raising awareness of the huge impact that this disease has on people, but also enabling us to see just how debilitated people are.
Absolutely. So one other question that we had was about any age limits to participation. So Sadie, maybe you could speak to what we're thinking about as far as collecting from younger patients, older patients.
Yeah, so we will not have an age limit. Obviously, we're going to capture age and we're going to capture how long it's been since you've been diagnosed. Importantly, we are going to make sure that the registry enables data to be captured from pediatric patients 12 years old and up. And we've had initial discussions with Peter Rowe, who many of you know is an expert at Johns Hopkins. He's on SMCI's Research Advisory Council. But we've been talking to him about how to make sure that the data from pediatric participants is best collected. For example, we've been looking at how to incorporate pediatric quality of life inventory and functional disability inventory for children, so that we're really capturing data that is relevant to that population.
Perfect. It's good to hear that we won't be excluding those that are younger. I know Dr. Rowe's done a lot of great work around that.
We want this to be very, very inclusive, but we just want information so that on the back end, it's very easy to understand what data we have available, age, gender, physician confirmed, case definitions. We're being inclusive, but on the back end, we're being very clear about what we have in the data so that researchers can, if they want to, apply a very stringent kind of application to what they're looking for.
Yeah, kind of in that vein, actually, we got another question from someone who was speaking about individuals that have very severe ME and the kind of variability in symptoms experienced by that group. For example, the degree of sensitivity to light and sound, or an inability to move. And so maybe you could speak to a bit about why we were thinking of, you know, why we are designing a sort of a survey through the app longitudinal collection that is of these kind of core symptoms, and then including an option to do customizable tracking, and what we think how that might benefit both individuals with ME and the research as far as clarity of the data.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we went back and forth on this, right? Like, there are a lot of symptoms that we could track, and initially we thought we would allow patients to track and enter data on whatever they thought was important to them. The challenge that we ran into with that is that on the back end, it's really difficult to look at trends or to identify subtypes or to, you know, do anything if everybody's entering different data. So where we landed was this sort of halfway mark where we are collecting data on core symptoms, and that information will enable us to look at the population level as to what's happening. But importantly, the app allows you to enter and track on whatever you want. So you personally can track whatever you want. You can also choose to submit that data to the registry if you want that additional information to be part of your patient profile. But it was really, we really were just trying to bridge those two needs, right? The need for the data to be aggregatable with the need for people to be able to personalize their data capture. The other piece that we didn't touch on, but that we want to build out in phase 2 is we'd like caregivers to be able to have their own logins with the permission of the individual, obviously, but to be able to add kind of their own insights or to be able to see and track their loved ones' symptoms as well. And so that's something that we're working on for phase 2. Obviously, if you gave, you know, your mom or whomever your login, they would be able to kind of see what you see, but we'd kind of like it to be a little bit distinct and give the opportunity for the caregiver who often knows more or is able to take a more objective look at what they believe is happening to the individual. So that's something we're building out for phase 2.
That's great. So I think we're kind of running up against the clock here. I did see someone put in a comment about wanting to make sure that we send out a link to the recording of this so that they can share it with folks that they know. And that's actually a huge part of the registry, is not only, you know, individuals with ME, but we also really want to recruit healthy youth controls, because that's a big sort of lack of a resource within this space. And so we'll be sure to share all that. And again, as Sadie mentioned, actually, you know, I think we have time for one more question. Sadie pointed one out. Someone submitted that there's someone who suffers from CFS and is not able to maintain a regular schedule, which, you know, can be really common. So the every 3-day schedule might be difficult for them. And so what would happen if they missed every 3rd day of reporting? What does that structure look like?
Well, if you miss the 3-day reporting, someone would come to your house. So if you, of course, it would be no problem. You can dismiss the push notifications, and you can just say, I was not able to complete this data point, right? I mentioned that you can switch the frequency to weekly if you believe every 3 days is too frequent for you. So the last thing we want is for this data entry to be stressful. The other thing I would say is we've done the best we can from a human-centered design perspective to create this in a way which people want to use, that they'll stay engaged with, which is useful to them as well as us, that researchers find useful, where they can access the data. We've spoken to, surveyed, interacted with. Really, this is a collective effort across the community, but we're not going to roll it out and it's going to be 100% perfect. So we're going to iterate, right? We'll roll it out. It's the best. We'll do it to the best of our ability, to the best of the insights we've got. We're going to tweak it as we go. We may roll it out. Everybody hates the push notifications. It's just enough, right? So then, okay, well, then we'll take away the push notifications. So we're going to be evaluating this probably in the beginning quarterly, and then every 6 months we're going to be coming back to people, and we'll have pilot groups who do initial testing. We'll probably come back to those groups and say, is this working? Yes, no. We'll iterate. But I think the important thing is that we want this to be useful, easy, helpful to you, and useful, easy, helpful to researchers. By kind of making this kind of a partnership, creating these big data sets, I really feel like we're going to be able to make an impact.
Absolutely. Well, I'm certainly feeling inspired, and I hope everyone else is too. I mean, just even seeing this quote, knowing I'm contributing to the bigger picture, I think that's really the spirit that's within the ME/CFS community from what I've, witnessed.
Yeah, and like we are with you, right? Like this is about all of us. We've called it you and me. It's you and me. It's everybody. And so we want everybody to be excited about being part of the You and Me movement. This will contribute to the big picture, and know that we're here for any and all feedback as we continue to finalize, launch, pilot, test, to iterate this registry. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sadie. And then just quickly mention that we have one more webinar coming up with Dr. Jared Younger.
Yeah, so I'm sure many of you are going to be super excited about this, because I know I am. Jared was one of our Ramsey awardees from 2016. He received a grant from us in 2016 and has really generated some incredibly cool, exciting data where he's looking at neuroimaging of patients and healthy controls. And many of you know Jared recently applied for an NIH grant to study this further in a much bigger, more comprehensive way. And so I strongly encourage you to join this webinar if you can. I think it's going to be super interesting. Jared's a great speaker, and the data that he has available is just very compelling. So that's next Thursday, December 13th at 10 a.m. Pacific or 1 p.m. Eastern. And last, these are some links where you can stay in touch with us, register for future webinars, you can get latest updates, and you can, there's the click to donate where you can fund our research or the progress we're making with the registry. So thank you to everybody. I really appreciate you joining this. I really appreciate you contributing to the survey that we sent out ahead of time. If you haven't completed that, we'd love it if you could. And again, we're here for any and all questions and feedback by email after this webinar ends.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.